Last week's Brexit vote left the world in a state of surprise. In Africa, the continent remains cautious as countries prepare to deal with the fallout. Economists, however, say realities of the vote remain unclear for now.
I think this Brexit is a complication for not only for Britain and for Europe, but for the rest of the world. So there will be spillovers. For example, Britain will be distracted in its aid policy. I think DFID will have a more difficult time in the next year or two making long-term policies. I think the aid budget is likely to be cut.
Sub-Saharan Africa has achieved annual growth of more than 5% over the last decade. However, the systems and reforms needed to diversify economies are taking longer than expected. Britain's Taller Oil has already ventured into oil and gas production in East and West Africa, with ventures in Uganda, Kenya and Ghana. The uncertainty in the EU could take focus away from what is happening in Africa's economies.
Investors stop investing when there's uncertainty. They run to the safe havens. And so the longer there is uncertainty, the worse it is for all parties. So I hope that this process of exit takes place more quickly, within a year, perhaps. During that period, I think we're going to find a lot of preoccupation in Britain and a difficulty of focusing on outside issues.
ECOWAS over in West Africa has a treaty with the EU under the Economic Partnership Agreement, or EPA. This gives the African nations access to the European market. Analysts say Brexit is unlikely to change the course of upcoming EPA deals.
I doubt that there will be much disruption. Certainly, the European Union, vis-a-vis its outside counterparts, like West Africa, will try to say everything's normal, business as usual. So I think they won't try to disrupt that partnership agreement, and my expectation is that it wouldn't be too calamitous.
Currencies, stocks and bonds on the continent tumbled following the Brexit decision. While things will undoubtedly settle with time, for now the continent continues to brace for more shocks, at least in the short term. Catherine Omwando, CCTV.
Now then, Kate Parkinson is live in Brussels tonight with the latest data on the Brexit. Kate, we've got a fairly clear idea of who may eventually succeed David Cameron as Conservative Party leader. Quite a few candidates coming up ahead of the nominations. But what about the Labour Party, and how does this leadership fight over there affect exit talks?
Well, firstly, with the Conservative Party, there is a pretty logical assumption that the lead Brexit campaigner, former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, will take the top job. But actually, he's not the bookies' favourite. The bookmakers are now tipping Home Secretary Theresa May as the likely next Prime Minister. Meanwhile, in the opposition Labour Party, it is chaotic scenes. The current leader, Jeremy Corbyn, refusing to step down despite the fact that he lost a no confidence vote among MPs. The results of this Labour rebellion that we are seeing could have a big impact on the Brexit negotiations. Certainly, if Corbyn does stay, he will be wanting his grassroots left-wing ideals to be reflected in the negotiation. But if he is toppled by Labour rebels, then we could see a very different situation, because they are saying they think the best way of getting rid of their leader is to relaunch, resurrect Labour's pro-EU stance, because they think if they do that, then they can get all the disgruntled Remain voters on board and they'll campaign to topple the leader. Now, if this happens, then we're going to have a pro-EU opposition party in the face of an increasingly Eurosceptic ruling party, and that could make for some very divisive Brexit negotiations off the back, of course, of a very divisive Brexit campaign.
Indeed. Speaking of the EU, though, the Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, he was also calling earlier today for reforms to address what he described as a democratic deficit in the EU. But what specific changes is he proposing?
Absolutely. The Greek Prime Minister said that he hopes the results of the UK referendum will act as a wake-up call for the European Union. He's long complained that there's a democratic deficit, as he calls it, in the EU, and he wants reforms to focus on social cohesion and solidarity. We have heard talk of reforms here in Brussels today. They didn't go into details, though, and they said they're not new reforms. They just want to speed up the implementation of the existing reform agenda. Now, that does include changes in to try and make the European Union more democratic, along with other areas of reform such as the economy, migration, energy, the usual suspects. But certainly they are aware of the need to make democratic changes to the bloc, to connect it better with the people it says it represents. And certainly this is something that the Greek Prime Minister really wants. We'll hear more about the reform agenda, putting more meat on the bones, so to speak, when the leaders meet again in September in Bratislava. And of course, by then, we may have exit negotiations underway. Of course, we may not. At this point, it's anyone's guess.
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks for the update. That's Kate Parkinson live in Brussels.